mind, I'd like to sit down. I've been a member here of the ever since Keith's crew back in the early 90s. And yes, the group has grown a lot, and it's been a very enjoyable experience. I was a pilot on B-17s. I'm also a graduate aeronautical engineer, so I can tell you without, you know, from an expert's opinion, B-17 was a far better airplane. The only reason that they built so doggone many B-24s was that Henry Ford built them. You know, you can't build anything in small quantities. Well, all kidding aside, they were both good airplanes. Flying and aviation has been my vocation and avocation, hobby, as long as I can remember. Most of us grew up in the heyday of aviation, you know, with the Lindberghs and the Jimmy Doolittles and the Jimmy Matterns. Remember those serials on Jimmy Mattern when we were kids? But I got the Army Air Corps in my craw. I wanted to be a pilot in the Army Air Corps. When I was in the 6th grade, 11 years old, the teacher asked us to stand up and state what we wanted to be when we grew up. And that's what I said, a pilot in the Army Air Corps. As far as I can remember, I never wavered. When I graduated from high school, I went to the university and I majored in aeronautical engineering. And that was September of 1941, so you know what happened by the end of the first quarter. We were at war. I didn't sign up immediately. I was kind of a romantic, you know. I wanted to sign up on the campus. There was a Navy and an Air Force recruiting group that were coming out to recruit us, and they didn't get there till May, so I didn't sign up flight training until May. And with the big influx of pilots and the lack of the equipment that the Air Force had, the Army Air Corps had, I should say, I didn't get called up until February of 1943. But it's funny how time works out, what happens to you. In that little interim period there, that summer, I met the girl who was to be my wife in the future. If I'd signed up in a hurry, I don't know who I'd have married or what I've been doing. But a lot of those first pilots that signed up early became the instructor pilots. They became ferry pilots. And a lot of us that were later got over to combat first. I graduated from flying school in March of 1944, and by August of 44, I was in Europe with the 8th Air Force. I flew 35 missions with the 8th Air Force. I'm going to kind of go over the whole thing that, very briefly as to what my experiences were, and then I'll go back and tell you about some of the detailed missions. I finished, in World War II, my most significant flying was the 35 missions, B-17s, 351st Bomb Group. At the very end of the war, I went to ground school in a C-54. The next thing I knew, I was headed for the Pacific. And we left on August 15th, and halfway over the Hawaiian Islands, they announced that Japan had surrendered verbally, not formally. And a bottle of bourbon was passed around that airplane, and that was our celebration of the end of the war. I was sent over to Hawaiian Islands to be a co-pilot on a C-54, an airplane I had never flown before. But the Air Force assembled 450 crews, pilot, co-pilot, engineer, navigator, and they sent over 150 airplanes with those 450 crews to Okinawa. And I flew in on August 29th into Japan for the first time, and I flew three more times in Japan. Never got off at Atsugi Airport. We'd fly in with a bunch of troops. They'd unload, and we'd fly out. It was quite an experience. When I finished that little stint, I got out in October of '45. I had plenty of points. And I went back to school, finished up June of '47, aeronautical engineering, got married to the girl I met way back when, flew in the reserve out here at Walter Chamberlain, and lo and behold, we got recalled in 1951, Korean War. I went for a year with SAC as an engineering officer and a pilot, and then I went up to Alaska for 2 years as an engineering officer, a job that evaporated before I got up there, so I went back to flying. I flew as a duty pilot with 5039th Air Transport Squadron in Alaska for a year, and then I took over their maintenance operation the second year and still flew my own test hops. Had a lot of experiences at that, but I'm not going to talk about that today, more than that. I got home, I went back to school. I was going to be a PhD. Well, I didn't like the academic life. And I got a job with Honeywell, the aeronautical division. That's where I spent 32 years. I worked engine controls, which included supersonic inlet controls. I was also the program manager of the Space Shuttle main engine controls. You know, the 3 main engines on the Space Shuttle. Well, I had a large crew that developed that control for that, for those engines. They're the reusable engines, not the solid propellants that are dumped. After that, I was also I had something to do with the hand controllers on Apollo earlier than that. I also did, for the last 13 years I was there, I did the Navy's torpedo, the Mark 50. We designed and built and got into early production, the Mark 50 torpedo. Well, that's a synopsis. That's why I tell you that I've been in aviation or the war all of my life. It's been my whole life except for very few years. Now going back to the beginning, a little more detail. I went to single engine training. I went through Quero for primary. Any of you that know the various fields. I went to Waco for basic flight training. I went to Moorfield, Mission, Texas for advanced single engine training, not multi-engine. You know, I thought I was going to be a hotshot fighter pilot. Well, it didn't. I graduated single engine, but the weather was so bad we didn't get in all our time. We didn't get in our gunnery. And we were the first class to feel the brunt of all of the backlog of pilots that they were accumulating. We didn't have any orders for a week. We sat around with no job. Finally, they called us into the theater and they asked us if any of us had any engineering time. Well, just about the whole group of those 400 or 500 guys that were in that theater had as much engineering time as I did, but only a few of us raised our hands. We were the more naive people, you know. And before the day was out, I found myself with orders to go on 15-day leave and then to report to Liberal, Kansas, which was a B-24 transition school. That was the closest I ever came to, you know, having a hazardous... Well, as luck would have it, when I got home, 10 days after I got home on leave, I got a Twix canceling that. And I went to Eagle Pass, Texas, godforsaken place right on the border of Mexico, where we took gunnery. And gunnery is air-to-air gunnery and air-to-ground gunnery. I did okay on the air-to-air. In fact, you know, that you shoot at a target that's towed. But on the air-to-ground, you do a little rectangular pattern. All the instructors, pilots are all in a trail formation, you know, with quite a bit of distance between us. And you do a pattern that's like a landing pattern, only opposite in direction. And that, being a left-hander, that kind of fouls me up. I made my first pass, and then the target is a big billboard thing. You come in at 1,000 feet, and you turn on a base leg, and then you turn on what amounts to the final approach, and you dive down at that target for 1,000 feet or so, and firing at it with 130 caliber in the wing of your AT-6. And it was the bullets that you painted a color, so they've always detect whether you hit it or somebody else did it. Well, anyway, the first one I screwed up the approach pretty bad, and felt because of that left-handed business. You know, left-handers can't skate the same direction, for instance, that a right-hander can. It's always hard. And so I came around, and this time I nailed it. I hit that approach. I came straight at that target, and I held it just as long as I possibly could. And I pulled up, plenty of room. I didn't hit the ground. But the range officer thought I might have. And he got mad. He screamed at me on the radio, and he says, you know, you almost hit the ground, and you're fined $25, and go back and report to your instructor. Well, I did that with a heavy heart, because we had the staff of a couple of guys from the 8th Air Force that were on the base that were looking for co-pilots. And they caught everyone with the least infraction they could find. They took us for co-pilots, and that's what happened to me. Right away, I became a co-pilot, and before the day was out, I was headed for San Antonio and then up to Lincoln, Nebraska to join a crew on a B-17 as a co-pilot. Never flown multi-engine, never seen a B-17. Well, that evening, I met another fellow that he was also disqualified. He came in on that approach, and instead of missing the turn, he flipped over on his back, or thereabouts. And he recovered in 1,000 feet, which in an AT-6 is a real, I mean, he was a good pilot. So there was proof that we were just being screwed. He and I met at the hotel desk, and they didn't have many rooms there, so we shared a room. And both of us were down in the dumps. He was a little older than I was, a little more worldly. And he says, he gave me, you know, I pulled from, he had a bottle and I had a few drinks. And we went out looking for some girls and brought some girls up to the room. And now at 21, I was a virgin. I had never been with a girl before in my life. I don't mind telling you all about that, because I'm sure all of you are almost as naive. Maybe not quite. But you know, it wasn't a good experience. Never is the first time, I don't think. And I got so disgusted with the whole affair. I wasn't married, I wasn't engaged, I never had a steady girl. But I did have a girl who I had my eye on. She's the one I did marry. And I got so disgusted with it that I just told him I had to use strong words. I says, this disgusts the hell out of me, and I'm getting out of here. He didn't mind because he was having trouble with this girl anyway. He wanted the other girl. So that's what I did. I got out of there, and I vowed to myself, if I got to be, you know, by that time I was over what little booze I had, and I felt very bad about what I did. I thought it was bad. And I said to myself, if I have to be a co-pilot, I'm going to be the best damn co-pilot I possibly can. And that's the right attitude. I was a good co-pilot. Joined a crew in Lincoln, Nebraska. Most of them were older than I was. There was a few gunners that were only 19, but I was 21. Pilot was about 23. Bombardier was about 25, and we had a couple gunners that were as old as 35. We went to Alexandria, Louisiana for RTU training, replacement training, you know, before going overseas, as many of you did. We finished that up, and we went to, we picked up a brand new airplane in Kearney, Nebraska, B-17, and we flew it overseas from Kearney. We got to, took us about a week. We were, no, longer than that. We were a week in in Iceland because the weather was bad in Wales where we were going to dump the airplane. We took the airplane over to to a place where they modify it for combat. They take off the de-icing boots, and they take out the glycol heater and all kinds of good things. They take out the APU, so forth. Well, we went down to Bovington to a combat school. I don't know how many of you fellows went there for 10 days. While there, I had a strange experience. Sitting in the barracks one Sunday afternoon, talking to another guy. All of a sudden, we heard a guy come on the radio, and he says, "Red alert!" Boom! We had a huge explosion. Turned out that about a block away, a V2 overshot London and hit the base. That's another close call. Not quite as close as that B-24 stint, but pretty close. We went to 351st, which is at Polbrook, United Kingdom. And most of you may not know where that is. It's about 10 miles from Peterborough. Old English base that had everything close to the flight line. We were within a block of everything. We flew our first couple of missions. We got indoctrinated to flak. On our third mission, our group lost 6 airplanes out of 36. That was about the biggest loss that our group ever had, even in the very early days. I saw the fighters from a distance, but they didn't attack our squadron. They looked to us like they knocked down the whole 12 ships from the other squadron, but I suppose some of them were just flying to get away. But that was what I thought was a fairly close call anyway. About my 5th mission, the pilot came to me and he says, "Johnny," nobody ever called me Elmer in those days, thank God. And he says, "Johnny," he says, "I've been asked to check out for lead." And he says, "You know what that means? That if I make lead, then you won't be flying with me, except on when they flew deputy leads, because the air commander sits in the co-pilot seat." So I was kind of going to become a spare co-pilot again. And I felt bad because I liked that crew. By then I was satisfied being co-pilot. There's nothing wrong with being a co-pilot. The only thing you don't do is land. I mean, when you fly formation, you trade off every 15 minutes with a pilot. And I always thought I could fly formation better than he could. Maybe it was that fighter experience. I don't know. Maybe I was just all wet. Whatever the case, I did feel bad. And I started flying with various other crews as a spare co-pilot whenever they needed one. And on my 16th mission, or the 15th mission, we went to Mersburg. You all know where Mersburg is, how bad that was. But I obviously made it back okay. But there was one guy that didn't. He aborted. And he aborted because his fuel gauges showed him he didn't have enough gas. Well, nobody ever used the fuel gauges as more than a gross indication how much fuel you got, because they topped off the tanks, before you left, and then you used just time and power setting. You used about half your fuel on the way over and about half of what you had left on the way home, and that's the way it went. Anyway, on my 16th mission, I was assigned to this pilot, never met before. He had 33 missions, and he was going to get me home by Christmas. Well, he was a nice guy, and it was very easy. We didn't even talk much, You were so well trained by that time that you just did your job, whatever your job was, and we didn't communicate too much. And funny thing happened there again. Taxiing out, just got started taxiing out from the hard stand. The fields were all a big perimeter around the X of the runways. And then you took that perimeter to where you took off. Well, these hard stands, that dispersed the airplanes so that, most of you know that, but for those that don't, that's how they dispersed the airplanes, so fighters couldn't knock them out like they did our fighters in Hawaiian Islands when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Well, anyway, we blew a tire. I never saw any tire ever seen blown in my life. And while I was gawking at the tire, I'm down on my side, but I wasn't even taxiing it, so it wasn't my fault. But he was on the radio getting a truck and getting another airplane and getting us on that mission. He was gonna get on that mission if it killed us. So anyway, we did. We caught up with the formation before they joined the bomber stream, and we flew the left-hand ship in the high element, and that meant that the lead that I flew off of, where we flew off of, was on my side. So when we went on the bomb run, when we turned on IP, he turned it over to me, and I flew the bomb run. We had just dropped our bombs, and we're starting a shallow dive, you know, away from the target to get out of the flak. We were getting a lot of flak because we were at Bolin, which is another Mersburg, a less well-known Mersburg, but it's in the same area, roughly. Synthetic oil plant. And suddenly, at the corner of my eye, I saw something more than a barrage. I saw boom, boom, boom. You know, somebody was tracking us or the lead or whatever. And all of a sudden, there was a mighty explosion. It was like a big compression wave. And I felt something sharp hit my wrist. I was holding onto the throttles. And I was in tight formation. I couldn't do much immediately, but I loosened it up a little, and I looked into the cockpit. I looked at the pilot, and he had a hole in his head the size of a big soup saucer. And there was blood all over the cockpit. It was a terrible looking thing. And in back of me, the flight engineer was getting out of his upper local turret, and we had hydraulic fluid all over the floor, and it was burning. Apparently a hot particle of flak hit that and momentarily set it on fire. He stomped that out with those big boots we wore, you know. But I had to fly formation. We had fighters in the area, and our group got somehow separated from the rest of the groups, and I had to stay with them regardless of what was going to happen. I looked at the engines, and they were all okay. The ship flew okay. There was a hole right above the pilot there was a little plexiglass window back of the main windshield, and that was blown out. And we didn't get a direct hit. We just got a big slug of flak that came in, apparently knocked that window out, went right through the pilot's flak helmet, and literally killed him. He was still breathing, but he never regained consciousness again. I quickly tried to get somebody on the interphone to come up and help him. I didn't know what they were going to do for him. It was pretty obvious that he wasn't going to live. And they did. Somebody came up and turned on the emergency oxygen. And a little later, the flight engineer got up with me, and the first thing he said to me is, "I can fly it, sir." "You can fly it? Why do you have to?" I can fly it. And he says, "Well, look at your arm." And my arm that was holding the throttles, the whole sleeve was just shredded. And there was blood all over it, but it wasn't my blood, it was the pilot's. He just splattered the whole cockpit. When I convinced him I could fly, he quit it. I thought he was humping for a Medal of Honor or something. He was a good man. He was about 5 years older than I was. Before the flight ended, I was very glad we had him because he was moral support. Good flight engineer. Good guy. Well, we couldn't get the pilot out of the seat. You know, B-17 is pretty small. There's no place to put him. We couldn't lay him down. It's such a huge wound. I didn't think he was going to live. The best thing we could do was turn on the emergency oxygen and hope that he could survive. Now stop to think about it. Our options were cut off. Obviously, with the hydraulic reservoir gone, the B-17 doesn't have hydraulic pumps on each engine. They only had a small hydraulic pump behind the co-pilot on a panel, and that gave you pressure for your brakes and for the cowl flaps. The only thing a B-17 used hydraulics for. So I knew instantly when I saw that ruptured hydraulic tank that we wouldn't have any brakes when we had to land. Well, he was so badly injured, I knew I couldn't land him under emergency conditions. I couldn't belly it in. I couldn't run off the end of a runway without brakes. And moreover, he'd need something in excess of a neurosurgeon if any good was to be done at all. So I made up my mind pretty quick. I had heard 2 weeks before that about a field at Wittering, which was right near our base. It was a 3-mile runway, grass runway. It was just meant for things like landing an B-17 without brakes. I guess I better hurry up. So that's where I went. Stayed in formation for 2 hours before we reached the enemy lines, friendly lines, I already put it. And then I made a beeline for England all by myself. The navigator gave me a heading. I built up airspeeds about 200 miles an hour, and I went to Wittering. I went by our base. When I went by our base, I reported into the tower and told them what had happened. And they said, flight control operator come back, and he said, Roger, thus and such, if you're a checked out co-pilot, proceed to Wittering and land. I don't know what I would have, I didn't let that stop me because I wasn't checked out. And I didn't have time to smile as I might have now. But anyway, 10 minutes later, we got in the pattern for Wittering, and just as I was about to let down, and he had to crank down both the gear and the flaps because the same flak that had hit the reservoir also injured a junction box there and knocked out those electric motors that would take the wheels and the flaps down. So after he cranked those down, I started a landing approach. One thing I forgot to tell you, most co-pilots don't have much landing experience. Their pilots only have maybe 70, 80 hours more than they, and they've been through transition, but they're not instructor pilots. And most of the time, they only gave their co-pilots a couple landings. Well, when my pilot checked out for lead, he says, you're going to have to fly a lot of practice missions with me. And so he says, every time we land on a practice mission, you can land it. Well, I accumulated about 12, 15 landings in a matter of a month or two. And even though he couldn't instruct me very well, I got some practice in landings. I knew I could land the airplane okay. I never thought about it that the crew didn't really know whether I could land it because most of them were used to, their pilots, co-pilots didn't have landing experience. It was very quiet on the interphone. Nobody complained, nobody said a word. Of course, I was on the radio most of the time, but anyway, I started in on my approach, and the Spitfire cut me out. He flashed his big elliptical wing in front of me and got in my way. I had to go make a go-around on full flaps. Just about drove the flight engineer nuts, but, if you keep your airspeed up, you can make that. And so I did, and I landed without a vent. I don't know how far we coasted, but we used up at least 2 miles of the 3 miles. And we landed fine, and slowed down and taxied back to this English officer. He looked like Walter Pigeon. He, very nice. I sent the rest of the crew with the pilot. They came up and got him. 4 guys took to get him out of there. He was still breathing. I couldn't understand how he could possibly be breathing for the damage that was done to him. But it turns out that there's a motor function way down in the base of your brain that keeps the breathing apparatus going. They got him to the hospital, and that's one reason I chose Wittering, because it had a British Army hospital right adjoining the field. They took him over there. I sent the crew over with them to give blood if they needed it. They sent him right back. I don't know if they did anything for him. When we got back to the base an hour later, they called and said he was dead. Well, that was my indoctrination to being a first pilot. And there was a major that came over with the crew. In fact, the flight engineer and the navigator were his crew. They were flying spare because he didn't need it. A crew either. And he told me he would check me out. He was an instructor pilot before he came over. in B-17s. So he says, I'll check you out and you can fly my crew. Well, that happened at the 27th and 28th of December. This happened, this pilot got killed on November 30th. And they flew me on about two more missions, but one of those missions, the last mission was one at the Battle of the Bulge when we never did get back to our own base. The weather turned bad. I'm sure any of you who flew that time will remember that. We landed at various fields all over the coast of England. And so I got in 3 missions before he checked me out as a first pilot. Then he took me out, and on 2 days, 2 hours each, he put me through a formal checkout that was really thorough. He pulled all the throttles on me and say, now land it. I thought it was dead stick. It wasn't dead stick quite. But he gave me his crew, and probably the flight engineer is the one that got me the position. Anyway, I flew that crew then for my last 16 missions, and we did very well. Did have one more mishap, flying over the Ruhr Valley at a target. We lost 2.5 engines. One of them was windmilling. We limped out of a barrage field that lasted for 35 minutes, and we Brussels was only about 40 minutes away, but I was at 105 miles an hour. I had to hold every bit of altitude I could get because I wasn't about to climb on 1.5 engines. One engine was leaking oil and I couldn't hold full power on it. Other one was good. We had a group of fighters high overhead, didn't know whose it were. It turned out that they were American fighters, and they escorted us to Brussels, and then they buzzed us when I got in the landing pattern. Well, I got in a landing pattern, straight in approach. I wasn't going to fool around with the pattern. I couldn't go around. And lo and behold, another Spitfire came along. Big elliptical wing right in my face. This time I thought he was going to lead me in, which he did. I followed him in. You know, there was a light snow on the ground, and I was kind of uncertain where the runway was until we got about that close to it. I followed him all the way down that runway. I could see the scarf that he had around his neck. And all fighter pilots wear scarves, white scarves. And we landed in formation, literally. And when I slowed down enough, I was afraid he'd stop all of a sudden and I'd bang into him. So when it stopped, I rolled it off, and we lost all the oil on that 3rd engine. We ended up with only one good operating engine. I couldn't even taxi the airplane. We left it where it was. We spent a week in Brussels. We had a high old time, believe me. It was, you know, there wasn't any food, but there was a lot to drink in Brussels. I don't know why they had used that priority, but they did. I never drank much after that first escapade when I became a co-pilot anyway, so it didn't matter. We had fun. It made up for it. Got home and finished up my missions. I got home on Easter Day in 1945. Went home on leave, came back, got in ATC, and did that stint to Japan. I couldn't even be a first pilot in ATC until you got 1,200 hours, at least not in a C-54. It was a beautiful airplane. And that, I did that, as I said, for 4 days. There was a whole bunch of wrecked airplanes on the base at Atsugi. I robbed it of 4 instruments. Good thing they didn't have bombs in them or something. And went home and got out of the service, and that was it for that war. I'm running too late, so I won't tell you about the Korean War, maybe some other time. I was thankful to be alive, went back to school, finished up, got married in June of 1947. And I never did have to fly B-24s.